From inadequate medical care to forced hysterectomies, from overcrowding to a generalized framework that criminalizes and punishes immigrants, private immigration detention centers are arbitrary and cruel and should be abolished. Recent legislation in 2001 by President Biden mandating that private prison contracts be terminated has led to an increased push for privatized immigration detention centers to be eliminated as well. There have been recent closures of private ICE facilities, private prison facilities, due to mistreatment of detainees. Today I will argue that the federal government should terminate all contracts with all private detention centers around the country. Recently in the news, in Georgia, there were human rights violations, including forced hysterectomies and surgeries, and there have been legislations in many states to end privatization of detention centers. There are several advocates for reform, including the ACLU, the American Immigration Council, the ASBC, the Freedom for Immigrants, and others. Conversely, the private detention centers themselves, shareholders, ALEC, and others are proponents of maintaining privatized detention centers. It is a very, very lucrative business, with GEO Group bringing in over $184 million in fiscal year 2017, followed by Corrections Corporation of America, or Core Civic Group, coming in at $135 million in fiscal year 2017. So obviously there is a very huge financial incentive for them to push back against eliminating privatized detention immigration centers. I stand with advocates of human rights and dignity in direct opposition to privatized immigration detention centers. Now, I have never personally been incarcerated, but I did work for a time in Idaho at a private prison that was nicknamed Gladiator School. It was called that because of the absolutely insane level of violence that was there. My opinion is not born out of self-interest, but rather out of concern for basic human decency and human rights. I spent a lot of time researching the pros and cons of privatized immigration detention centers. And after researching this and looking at the abundance of information out there, I have become convinced of the need to abolish the privatized immigration detention centers. Today I'm going to present 3 reasons for abolishing the privatized immigration detention centers. First, there's no real oversight. They are not held accountable, and there's a great financial incentive for them to decrease medical and deputy staff to increase shareholder return, which leads to poor medical care and poor general oversight and abuse and neglect in the private immigration detention centers. Secondly, they are supposed to be solely a detention model. They should not be punitive. However, punishment and retaliation are rampant in the privatized immigration detention centers. And third, despite their claims to the contrary, it is no more economically feasible to house detainees in a private immigration detention facility than it is in the public sector. And there is a lot more transparency in the public sector than it is in the private sector. So we need to abolish the private immigration detention centers to help eliminate the real threat of harm and abuse posed by these private immigration detention centers. Reports of abuse are rampant, including medical abuse, nutrition issues, prolonged detention issues, legal issues. A lot of times they're housed in facilities that are very, very, very far away from areas where legal counsel is available to them. They don't have any legal counsel, so they have legal issues. Solitary confinement is rampant. There's family abuse, sanitation issues, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and religious issues that are all rampant in these facilities. They're frequently denied basic human needs like sanitation and nutrition issues. They're subjected to physical abuse, retaliation, and excessive use of segregation and lockdown. Second, they were not CDC compliant during COVID, so their basic human and constitutional rights were violated. For example, just during this whole COVID business that's been going on. 50 detainees were interviewed in 22 different facilities. 0 had the ability to socially distance. Their beds were on average 2.87 feet apart. 42% reported that they had 0 soap at all during the whole COVID issue. 82% said they had no access to hand sanitizer at all. 26% reported that there was no disinfection going on during the whole COVID situation. 21 out of 50 reported that they had symptoms of COVID. 3 did not report for fear of punishment or retaliation. 83% reported none of them were tested and none of them were isolated. So that's just an example of the basic human rights violations that occur in some of these private prison facilities. B, we should abolish them because it would take away the incentive to decrease medical care and deprive individuals of basic dignity and human rights through quality and safety concerns that are taken away when they don't have that financial incentive to decrease their staffing to increase shareholder return. So on average, their corrections officers earn about $23,850 less than those in the public sector. That leads to increased turnover and lack of incentive for adequate on-the-job training in these privatized areas. Some studies show that the assaults occur at 2 times the rate in these private facilities, and having worked at the Gladiator School here in Idaho, I can tell you it was absolutely crazy. It was somebody was getting stabbed and beat up and injured all the time. It was absolutely nuts. So I worked at the public prisons as well, and I can tell you the rate of assault, just from my experience, it was at least twice as high. So additionally, the Freedom of Information Act does not apply at these private facilities, so they don't have to report nearly as much as the public facilities have to report. So there's no oversight for these facilities. So there's not the same level of oversight. We don't really know what's happening behind closed doors. So we need to abolish them and crack down on punitive and retaliatory treatment in the system. So many detainees and also a nurse reported forced abdominal surgeries, forced medical procedures, including hysterectomies in one facility in Georgia. It was eventually shut down, but then all of those people were denied citizenship and they were deported really rapidly in what a lot of people are calling retaliatory deportation. So those that were not immediately deported were sent, many were transferred to another facility in Georgia where 8 have died over the last few years, most of those preventable. So given the clear and rampant abuse, why would anyone cling to the archaic notion that these private prisons are a good idea? So according to the opposition, they are less expensive. There are 0 studies to support this idea. They are not less expensive than the public sector. They argue that competition improves quality while lowering costs. However, there are 0 studies that support this. When they cut costs, the first thing they do is they cut amenities such as medical staff and deputy staff. And this increases the risk of violence and medical incompetence. The other thing that they do is they increase the length of stay. So for example, in 2015, the average length of stay was 21 days. In 2016, it was 22 days. In 2017, it increased to 34 days, and there are many, many facilities where the length of stay is even longer. But the actual cost in human rights violations in private detention centers versus public counterparts is immeasurable. So 179 detainees died between 2003 and 2018. 15 of those were housed by Corrections Corporation of America, or CoreCivic, in Arizona alone. So since 2017, 39 deaths have occurred in or immediately after detention. 12 of those have been suicides, and an independent analysis has decided that subpar medical treatment was a contributing factor in every single one of those deaths. And that's all in the private sector. Several states have already eliminated their contracts or have taken steps to move forward with eliminating their contracts with private sector. In April of 2021, Governor Jay Inslee signed House Bill 1090, which will eliminate all private detainee centers in Washington state by 2025. And in 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom signed AB 32, which will eliminate everything in California by 2019 or by 2028. So studies suggest that governments don't actually save money by using private detention centers, and the human cost is, like I said, immeasurable. And it is clear that the opposition is based on inflated rhetoric and not factual information. So in conclusion, I feel the federal government should abolish private immigration detention centers for a myriad of reasons, including these three. Private companies have financial incentives to cut medical and deputy staffing in order to boost shareholder return, which leads to subpar medical care, poor general oversight, abuse, neglect, and just poor treatment. ICE is solely supposed to be civil detention model. It is not supposed to be punitive treatment of detainees. However, punishment and retaliation is rampant. And third, despite its claims to the contrary, it is no more economically feasible to house detainees in the private sector than it is in the public sector, and it leads to more transparency overall. So it is time, in conclusion, for the federal government to take a strong stand on the issue of human rights and eliminate contracts with for-profit companies, thus sending a strong, clear message that we strive to uphold our values of liberty and justice for all.